Gunshots cracked across the canyon. 600 cattle surged in blind panic, horns clashing and hooves thundering against the narrow walls. A boy tumbled from his horse, helpless in the path of the stampede. From the ridges above, masked riders fired again. Driving the herd to slaughter, she didn't hesitate. A towering silhouette stepped from the shadows and ran straight into the killing path. No cry, no pause. Her hands slammed against the side of an abandoned wagon. Wood groaned. Iron shrieked. The heavy frame slid sideways, blocking the charge. The herd split around her like water, around stone. Dust settled. The only man still standing lowered his rifle, staring in stunned silence. She stood in the wreckage, breathing steady, untouched, as if this were simply another column in a ledger that needed balancing. Miles away, flames licked the hay barn, and on a desk inside the ranch house, an open ledger whispered of betrayal. The train came in late, not by much, 11 minutes, maybe 12. But Garrick Holloway had been standing on that platform since before noon, and 11 minutes felt like 11 years. When you were waiting for a woman you'd never met to step off a train and hand you a piece of paper that could take your whole life apart. He checked his pocket watch, put it away, checked it again. Amarillo smelled like coal smoke and horse sweat and the dust that never quite settled, no matter what season it was. Garrick stood with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slow, like a wheel that wasn't going anywhere. Around him, the depot went about its business. A porter wrestling a trunk onto a cart, two boys chasing each other between the benches until a station master's whistle cut them short. A dog asleep in a patch of sun that would move twice more before the day was through. He'd pictured her small. That was the mistake. That was the whole mistake, right there, standing on a wooden platform in the Texas Panhandle. In the spring of 1886, 45 years old, and about to be proven wrong, in a way he wouldn't recover from for a long, long time. He'd pictured a slight woman, pale, maybe pretty in a China doll way, the kind of woman his brother Eli always seemed to fall for. Delicate hands. A voice that trembled when it talked about grief. He'd built the whole shape of her out of Eli's letters. The ones that talked about a wife with a quick mind and a quiet laugh, and somewhere in his head that had translated into something breakable. Something he'd need to be careful with, the way you're careful setting down good china. He had not pictured this. The train hissed to a stop. Steam rolled out from under its belly like something exhaling after a hard climb. Doors opened down the line. Passengers stepped down, salesmen, with sample cases. A preacher in a black coat too heavy for the season. A family of 5 arguing about a trunk that wouldn't fit through the door, at the angle the father kept insisting on, and then the last car. The private one. The one the railroad clerk had told him, with a strange little smile Garrick hadn't understood at the time, was reserved special. The door opened. A boot came down first, then another. Then the rest of her, unfolding out of that train car like the car itself had been too small to hold her. The whole way from St. Louis, Garrick's hat stopped turning in his hands. She was tall, not tall like a tall woman. Tall like a doorway built for someone else. Tall like the woman who'd have to duck coming into his own kitchen, were about to find themselves looking up at her instead of down. 7 feet, maybe more. Broad through the shoulder in a way that filled out the traveling coat she wore, like it had been tailored for exactly that frame, and no other, which Garrick would later learn. It had, at considerable expense, by a seamstress in St. Louis who'd taken the commission. Without blinking and delivered work, Garrick's own tailor, in Amarillo would spend years trying to match, dark hair pinned back tight under a plain gray hat. A face that wasn't soft, wasn't hard either. Just still, just watching. She stepped onto the platform and the whole platform noticed not just Garrick. Everyone. The salesman stopped talking mid-sentence. The preacher's mouth hung open a half-second too long. A little boy near the ticket window pointed, and his mother yanked his hand down so fast he nearly fell over her. Even the dog lifted its head. Garrick didn't move. Because you don't move, do you? Not right away. Not when the whole story in your head just got torn up and thrown into the wind, and you're standing there holding the pieces, trying to figure out which way is up anymore. She looked at him, She knew him instantly. Of course she did. He was the only man standing there dressed like a rancher, hat in hand, staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. Which in a way he had. His brother's ghost, standing right there in the shape of the woman his brother had loved, Mr. Holloway. Her voice came down from somewhere higher than he expected and lower than he expected, both at once. Steady, not shy. Not apologizing for the space she took up in the world, ma'am. That was all he managed. One word. Ma'am. Like he was talking to the mayor's wife, instead of what? Instead of a woman built like she could have hauled the whole train off its tracks. Herself, a gust of veil, she held out a gloved hand, steady as a fence post. I believe you were expecting a smaller disappointment. Garrick blinked, because that landed like a slap, not unkind, just direct. Like she'd read the whole shape of his surprise off his face in the 2 seconds since she'd stepped down, and decided to name it before he could pretend otherwise. I wasn't expecting anything, he said, which was a lie, which they both knew was a lie. No, a small line at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile. You were expecting a small, sad woman in black. Someone you could put on the next train home inside a week. I've seen that look before, Mr. Holloway. On banks, on churches, on my own father most days. He didn't know what to say to that. So he did the only thing a panhandle rancher knows how to do when he doesn't know what to say. He reached for her trunk. It was heavier than it looked. He grunted, adjusted his grip, and before he could get it properly off the ground, she'd already taken the other end. I have it, she said. Ma'am, I have it. And she did. Lifted her end without so much as a shift in her breathing. Like the trunk weighed nothing at all. Like it was a hat box, and not 60 pounds of a dead man's widow's whole life. Packed into cedar and leather straps, Garrick let go of his end without meaning to. She carried it to the wagon alone, and Garrick followed a half-step behind her, watching the back of her coat move against the platform crowd. Watching the crowd part around her, the way water parts around something too large and too certain to argue with. Nobody said anything to her face. A few whispered behind hands. One old woman near the ticket window crossed herself, quick and small, and Garrick felt something hot rise in his chest at that. An anger he hadn't expected and didn't fully understand yet. On behalf of a woman he'd known for all of 4 minutes, he loaded the trunk into the wagon bed himself. This time without offering to help her do it, and she let him, watching with an expression he couldn't read. You'll want to know how long I mean to stay, she said. Once they were both settled, Garrick on the bench, Augusta beside him, the wagon groaning under weight it hadn't been built to carry, wasn't going to ask. Everyone asks. Eventually, she adjusted her gloves, unhurried. I'll save you the trouble of working up to it. I've come to look at what I've inherited. My husband's quarter share of your family's operation. I intend to examine it properly, before I decide whether to sell it back to you, or keep it. And if you decide to keep it? Something flickered in her gray eyes, quick, unreadable, gone before he could name it. Then I suppose we'll both have some adjusting to do, Mr. Holloway. Garrick flicked the reins and the wagon lurched forward. Out of the depot yard and onto the road that would carry them 40 miles into a life. Neither one of them yet understood they were about to share. The ride out to the ranch was 40 miles of Kalish Road and mesquite scrub, and a sky so wide it made a man feel small even on a good day. And this was not a good day. This was the day Garrick Holloway's whole understanding of the world had gotten up and walked off the train without him. He drove. She sat beside him on the wagon bench, which groaned under new weight it hadn't been built to carry. And neither of them said much of anything for the first 10 miles. He kept sneaking looks, couldn't help it. Every time he thought he had the measure of her, every time his eyes adjusted to the size of her, the way you adjust to a bright light, she'd shift, or breathe, or turn her head to watch a hawk cut across the sky, and the size of her would hit him fresh all over again. She caught him looking. Third time, maybe fourth, you can ask, she said. Eyes still on the horizon. Everyone wants to ask. Might as well get it over with, before we're 40 miles from anywhere, and you're still working up the nerve. Garrick's jaw tightened, Wasn't going to ask anything. You were thinking it loud enough I could hear it over the wheels. He said nothing. Because what was there to say? Because how do you ask a woman why she's the size of two women and expect there to be a good way to phrase it? An easy way, a way that doesn't sound like you're calling her a curiosity in a traveling show. My mother, Augusta said, after a while, when the silence had stretched long enough that she seemed to decide he'd earned the answer without asking for it. She was near as tall as I am. Her mother before her, taller still, they say. It runs in certain families, like red hair. Like a widow's peak. A pause, like a temper. Didn't mean to pry? You didn't pry. You looked. There's a difference, and most men don't know it. She finally turned her head toward him. Her eyes were gray, sharp as a ledger line. The ones who pry ask questions with their mouths open and their manners shut. The ones who just look and let a person explain in their own time, those are rarer. I'll allow you might be one of them. Mr. Holloway. Provisionally. Banker's daughter word, if he'd ever heard one. You can call me Garrick, he said, seeing as we're kin. Sort of. Something crossed her face then. Quick. Gone before he could name it. Sort of, she agreed. Quiet. They rode another 5 miles without talking. The land opened up around them, flat and gold-brown and endless. Cattle scattered dark across it like punctuation marks on a page too big to read all at once. A jackrabbit broke from a clump of yucca and ran a wide, panicked circle before vanishing into the scrub. Far off, a windmill turned lazy against the sky, one of the few Garrick's father had put up before deciding, in his later years, that a man who trusted machinery too much stopped trusting his own 2 hands. That's my range, Garrick said, nodding out at it, and something in his chest swelled the way it always did when he said those words. My range. 4,000 acres his father had carved out of. Nothing and his father before that, and now his runs clean to the cap rock. 1,800 head, give or take. Best water rights in 3 counties. He waited for her to be impressed. She wasn't looking at the cattle. She was looking at the grass. How much of that 4,000 is grazing you'd call good? She said, not a question. Or it was a question, but asked the way a school teacher asks a question she already knows the answer to. All of it. All of it. That's what I said. She turned her head slow, and there was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. Something that had nothing to do with her size, and everything to do with the fact that she'd grown up reading numbers, the way other children read fairy tales. I saw the grass thin out 4 miles back, she said, and I've been watching it thin further with every mile since. That's not good grazing, Mr. Holloway. That's land holding on by memory. Garrick's hands tightened on the reins. You've been in Texas half a day. I've been reading land my whole life. Land doesn't care how long you've been looking at it. It only cares whether you're looking right. He didn't answer that. Because what was there to say to a woman who'd stepped off a train 11 minutes late, and already, before she'd so much as seen his house, was telling him his own grass wasn't what he thought it was. He flicked the reins harder than he meant to. The horses picked up their pace. They passed a dry creek bed, the kind that only ran in a good spring, and Augusta noted it too, silent, her eyes tracking the line where water had once cut the earth and hadn't in some time. She said nothing about it. She didn't need to. Garrick was beginning to understand that her silences carried as much weight as her words. Maybe more, the way a held breath says more than a sigh. They rode the rest of the way in silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Before, it had been the silence of 2 strangers not knowing what to say. Now it was something else. Now it had a shape to it, a weight, like a held breath, like a door that had been left open a crack, and neither one of them was sure yet whether to push it wide or slam it shut. The ranch house came up out of the land, the way it always did at that hour, low and long, and the color of the dust around it, smoke curling thin from the kitchen chimney. Garrick had built the west wing himself, 10 years back. His father had built the rest. There was a kind of pride in that, in a house that carried 3 generations of Holloway hands in its walls, and Garrick felt that pride now the way he always did, until he saw Augusta looking at the barn roof. That's saggis, she said. It's fine. It's sagging, Mr. Holloway. On the north corner. You can see the line of it from here. He looked. He hadn't noticed. Which made it worse, somehow, that she had in the time it took the wagon to cover the last quarter mile. The hands came out to see to the horses. Little Ray, old Absalom, who'd worked for Garrick's father before Garrick was old enough to walk. They stopped what they were doing when Augusta climbed down off the wagon bench, stopped and stared, the way the platform had stared. Garrick watched their faces, watched them do the same arithmetic he'd done back in Amarillo. The shock, the recalculation, the effort not to let the shock show on their faces and failing at it anyway. Ray's mouth actually fell open, and he had to be nudged by Absalom's elbow before he remembered to close it. Only one man's face didn't show shock, Cyrus Tate, the ranch's foreman for going on 6 years now, a wiry man with pale eyes and a way of standing that always looked like he was calculating the angle of something. Cyrus watched Augusta climb down from the wagon with an expression Garrick couldn't quite place. Not shock, something closer to worry, which struck Garrick as strange. In the way a small thing strikes you strange, and then gets buried under 100 bigger things before you ever think on it again. Mrs. Vale, Cyrus, tipping his hat, polite, correct, and underneath it something coiled tight as a rattler in tall grass. Mr. Tate, Augusta's eyes went over him once, quick, cataloging, the same way she'd cataloged the grass. I understand you keep the books. I do, ma'am. I'll want to see them. A beat. Just a beat. But Garrick caught it, even if he didn't understand yet what it meant. Whenever you like, ma'am, Cyrus said, and smiled. And the smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Old Absalom, meanwhile, had come forward to take the trunk from the wagon bed, and when Augusta moved to stop him, I can manage it myself. The old man shook his head. Gentle but firm. Don't doubt it, ma'am, he said. But a man's ought to earn his keep somehow, and this ranch has had precious little use for my back these past few years beyond fixing what breaks. Let an old man feel useful. Something in Augusta's face softened at that, just slightly, and she stepped back and let him carry it, though Garrick could see the trunk cost the old man some real effort, and that she noticed it too, and filed it away the same way she filed away everything else, the sagging roof, the thin grass. The odd stillness in her foreman's face. Mrs. Odom, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway wiping her hands on her apron, and stopped dead at the sight coming up the porch steps. To her credit, she recovered faster than most. Supper's near ready, she said, which was, Garrick thought, exactly the right thing to say. The ordinary thing. The thing that made a strange house feel a little less strange. Supper that night was quiet in the way. Suppers get quiet when everyone at the table is thinking too many things. To say any of them out loud, Garrick sat at the head. Augusta across from him, in Eli's old chair. Though nobody had said so out loud, it had just happened that way, the way these things happen. The housekeeper, Mrs. Odom, had laid out beef and beans and cornbread, and kept sneaking looks at Augusta from the kitchen doorway like she expected the chair to give out from under her. It didn't. They ate in near silence. Fork sounds. The clock on the mantel. Wind picking up outside, the first real wind of the evening, rattling the shutters like something out there wanted in. My condolences, Garrick said finally, because someone had to say it, and he was the one at the head of the table, and it was the kind of thing his mother would have boxed his ears for not saying sooner. For Eli, Augusta's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, set back down, slow, on the edge of her plate. Thank you. He wrote about you. Some. Did he? Said you were the smartest person he'd ever met. Garrick turned his glass in his hand, not drinking from it, just turning it. I figured he was in love. Men in love say all sorts of things. Something moved behind Augusta's gray eyes, quick and gone. He was in love, she said. That didn't make him wrong. Garrick didn't have an answer for that either. The wind picked up harder outside. Somewhere out past the barn, a loose gate banged twice, then went still. He used to talk about this place, Augusta said, into the quiet, her voice gone somewhere softer than the sharp banker's daughter tone she'd carried since the train. The way you'd talk about a person you loved and were afraid of, both at once. Said his father built something out of nothing here. Said you'd die before you let a single acre of it go. That's true enough, he also said. She stopped, said, "What?" Augusta looked at him a long moment, weighing something. Deciding something. "Nothing," she said. "It'll keep." Garrick wanted to push. Didn't. There was something in the way she'd said it. "It'll keep." That told him pushing wouldn't get him anywhere tonight. Maybe not any night soon. How'd he die? Augusta asked, unprompted, some minutes later, when the beans had gone cold on both their plates and neither seemed inclined to finish. Truly. I know the word pneumonia. I don't know the shape of it. Garrick set down his fork. Fast at the end, he said, slow before that. He wrote me he had a cough that wouldn't shake back in the fall. I told him to see a doctor. He wrote back and said doctors were for men who didn't have work to do. A pause, his jaw tight. I should have gone to him, should have made the trip. I told myself the ranch couldn't spare me, and by the time I understood how bad it was, the trains weren't running fast enough to get me there before. He didn't finish the sentence. Augusta didn't finish it for him. I was there, she said instead. Quiet, at the end, he asked after you. Wanted to know if you'd gotten so stubborn yet that you'd finally sold off some of the far pasture. A small, sad ghost of a smile. I told him I didn't know, that I'd never met you. He laughed at that. Said I would, someday, whether I wanted to or not, because family finds its way back around eventually, one way or another. Garrick's throat worked. Sounds like him. It was exactly like him, Augusta said. He had a gift for saying true things in a way that didn't feel like being struck. I've never managed that particular skill myself. They finished the meal in silence again. When Augusta rose from the table, the chair scraped loud against the floorboards. And for one strange moment, Garrick found himself watching her, rise the way you watch a building go up. Slow and impossible, and somehow still surprising even though you'd seen the foundation laid. I'll want that lamp in the study, she said. If it's no trouble, and the ledgers. Wherever Mr. Tate keeps them. Garrick hesitated. It's been a long day, he said. Nobody expects you to start counting cattle your first night in Texas. Augusta looked at him, and there was something in her face then, tired, yes, grief-worn, yes. But underneath all of it, something that had never once in her whole life waited for permission to do what needed doing. My father has one rule, she said. Never sign your name to a thing you haven't looked at with your own eyes. I intend to look Mr. Holloway tonight, while the house is quiet, and there's nobody standing over my shoulder telling me what I'm meant to see. She left the room before he could argue. He heard her boots on the hall floor. Heard the study door open. Heard, a moment later, the scrape of a chair, and then nothing but the wind and the clock and his own heartbeat, loud in his ears, for reasons he couldn't yet name. She found the first hole by 9 o'clock. The lamp threw yellow light across a desk buried in ledgers. Some of them Eli's careful hand from years back, most of them newer, sloppier. A man's writing done in a hurry between chores. Augusta sat with her coat still on, though the house was warm enough, like some part of her hadn't yet decided to stay. She turned pages, fast at first. The way you skim a letter to get the shape of it, then slower. Then not skimming at all, one finger tracing down a column of numbers. Lips moving without sound, doing arithmetic the way other people breathed, feed costs. She frowned at the figure, frowned harder, flipped back 3 months, flipped forward again. The number for oats and hay from the Coombs supply house had gone up 4 times in 2 years. Not gradual, jumps, sharp ones. The kind that didn't track with any drought or shortage she'd read about in the papers on the train. She wrote something in the margin of her own notebook. Small, neat script, so different from the ranch hand's scrawl in the ledger itself. Coombs. Check against county rates, then further back. Payroll. 2 names caught her eye. Hired hands she hadn't yet met. Full wages, month after month, going back years, and beside their names in a different column, hours logged that didn't come close to justifying the pay. She sat back, not with judgment, not yet. She'd learned long ago that numbers on a page could mean a dozen different things. Before you understood the people behind them, she asked Garrick about it the next morning over coffee before the ride out. He didn't hesitate. "That'll be Absalom," he said. "My father's promise, not mine to break. Full wages till the day he dies. Hurt back or not. The man broke his spine, gentling a horse for my father 30 years ago and never once complained of it. That's not a hole in the books, Augusta. That's a debt of honor. It stays." She'd written it down anyway, not as a wrong to correct, as a thing worth knowing about the man sitting across the table from her, that some debts in his ledger were never meant to balance. But the numbers still had to be true before the rest of the story could matter. She turned another page. The land itself, here was where it got worse. Because here, laid out in her own hand now, copied from Eli's old notes and Garrick's newer ones, was the shape of 4,000 acres broken into sections. And 3,000 of those acres, according to the water logs, according to the grazing tallies, according to every column she could cross-reference against every other column, produced less than a fifth of the ranch's income. 3/4 of the land, 1/5 of the money. She sat very still for a long moment. Lamp flickering, the study gone cold around the edges, the way rooms do late at night, no matter how good the fire. Because this wasn't a hole, this was a decade. A decade of a man running 4,000 acres the way his father had run 4,000 acres, never once stopping to ask whether the land itself agreed with the plan. A decade of bleeding, slow and steady. The good 1,000 acres quietly carrying the weight of 3,000 more that should have been sold, or changed, or looked at honestly years and years ago. She thought of Eli's letters. The ones that talked about his brother with that particular ache. The ache you carry for someone you love and cannot save from themselves. He knows he's drowning. Eli had written once, months before the pneumonia took him. He just won't say the word out loud. Says drowning is a thing that happens to other men. Says Holloways don't drown. They just work harder. Augusta closed the ledger, opened her own notebook to a fresh page, and began. In that same neat banker's hand, her father had taught her, before she'd learned to read novels, to write down everything that was wrong. She worked through columns Garrick hadn't glanced at in years. The cost of fence wire against the acreage it enclosed, the wages of the 2 hired men against the sections they were meant to ride, the price of salt lick against the number of head it was meant to serve. Each figure alone told her little. Together they told her everything. A ranch that ran on habit instead of arithmetic, propped up by a good 1,000 acres carrying 3,000 more that had been dying by inches for a decade, unnoticed, because nobody had ever once sat down and made the land answer for itself. By 11, she had 4 pages of notes. By 1/2 she had begun cross-referencing the payroll dates against the seasons and found something that made her pause longer than anything yet. A run of months, 3 years back, where feed costs had spiked hard, precisely when Cyrus Tate's own signature appeared at the bottom of the invoice approvals for the first time. Before that, Eli's hand had signed them. After, Cyrus's. She didn't write a conclusion yet. Conclusions came after certainty, not before it. But she circled the date, twice, and underlined it once. The clock in the hall struck midnight before she stopped. Her hand ached. Her eyes ached worse. 4 pages of notes, dense with figures, and beneath the figures, in smaller writing she hadn't quite meant to add, a line that wasn't about money at all. He doesn't know. That's the terrible part. He truly doesn't know. She was still staring at that line when she heard it. A sound, out past the window. Not the wind, she knew the wind's voice by now, had been listening to it for hours. This was different. A scrape, a low grunt, the particular creak of a barn door being worked loose by someone who didn't want it to creak at all. Augusta went still, listened. There. Again. Closer to the corral than the barn now, and under it, faint, the shift and stamp of cattle disturbed from sleep. She stood. Didn't think about it the way another woman might have thought about it. Didn't weigh whether it was her place. Whether a guest in a strange house at midnight ought to go investigating strange sounds alone. Whether it was proper or safe or sensible. She simply stood and blew out the lamp and went to the window. Moonlight lay flat and silver across the yard, and there, at the edge of the near pasture, she saw it. A shape crouched low at the fence line, working at the wire, with something small and metal in its hand. A horse tethered a few yards off in the shadow of the mesquite, saddled, waiting, one rustler, maybe two, if there was a second she couldn't see from this angle. She thought about waking Garrick. The thought lasted exactly as long as it took her to remember. Which room was his, and how far down the hall it was, and how much that would calm while a man cut fence and started moving cattle into the dark. She went out the study door instead. Quiet, quicker than a woman her size had any right to be. The night air hit her like cold water. She crossed the yard without a lantern, letting the moon do the work, keeping to the shadow of the barn, the way she'd learned to keep to shadows a long time ago. In a life before Texas, in a life where a woman her size learned early that being seen wasn't always safe, wasn't always kind. The man at the fence didn't hear her coming. He was young, younger than she'd expected. Wiry, the way hungry men get wiry, working the wire cutters with hands that shook slightly. Nerves, maybe, or cold, or both. She stopped 10 feet behind him. "That's not your fence to cut," he spun. And froze, because whatever he'd braced himself to see, a rancher, a hired gun, even Garrick Holloway himself come out swinging, it hadn't been this. It hadn't been a woman, built like she'd stepped whole out of some frontier tall tale. Standing in the moonlight with her coat still buttoned from a night of reading ledgers, watching him with eyes that didn't so much as flicker with fear. "Who?" His voice cracked. Tried again. "Who in the hell are you?" "Doesn't matter who I am." Augusta took a step forward. Just one. It was enough to make him stumble back against the fence post. "What matters is, you're about to have a very bad night, and it isn't too late to make it a little less bad for yourself. Lady, you don't want." "I really do want," she said. "I want you to drop those cutters. I want you to walk to that horse of yours nice and slow. And I want you to ride back to whoever sent you and tell them the Holloway Range isn't an easy mark anymore. Tell them exactly that, word for word." He didn't drop the cutters. He lunged instead. It was not, Augusta thought later, much of a decision on his part. A young man, cornered, scared, doing the things scared young men do when they've run out of better ideas. She caught his wrist before the blade got anywhere near her. Just caught it. Didn't twist it, didn't break it, though she could have. Though the strength was there and had always been there, quiet under the surface of her, the way a river runs quiet under ice. She simply closed her hand around his wrist and held it, and watched his face change from fury to disbelief to something close to terror as he realized, in real time, that he could not move his own arm. "Drop it," she said again, calm, almost gentle. He dropped it. "The cutters fell in the dirt now," Augusta said. And there was something almost kind in her voice. "The kindness you might use on a dog that's bitten you out of fear rather than malice. You're going to ride home. And you're going to think, real hard, on your way there, about whether this is the kind of work you want to be doing when you're my age. Because a man who spends his whole life stealing what other men built, that's not a life. Son, that's just a slow way of disappearing." She let go of his wrist. He didn't wait around to argue philosophy. He was on his horse and gone into the dark before she'd finished her sentence. Hoofbeats fading fast toward the north line, toward whatever camp or cabin or crooked deal had sent him out here in the first place. Augusta stood alone in the moonlit pasture, breathing a little hard now that it was over. Not from the effort, there'd been no real effort in it, but from something else. Something closer to a familiar ache of having just shown a stranger exactly what she was, and, having no way now to take it back, she looked down at the cut fence, at the wire cutters lying in the dirt, and then she heard footsteps behind her, fast, and turned to see Garrick coming across the yard in his shirt sleeves. A rifle in one hand, hair wild from sleep, face gone pale in the moonlight. "I heard a horse," he said, breathing hard. "I heard. What happened? Are you hurt? Augusta, are you?" He stopped, looked at the fence, at the cutters, at her standing there whole and unhurt, and entirely impossibly calm. "There was a man," she said. "He's gone now." Garrick stared at her. "You went out here, alone, at midnight, after a rustler." "I went out here," she said, "because I heard a fence being cut, and a man in this house needed his sleep for the work he's got ahead of him tomorrow. Seemed simple enough at the time. Simple. He said the word like it tasted strange in his mouth. Augusta, he could have had a gun, he had a knife. That's not better. It is, in fact, considerably better. She bent, picked up the fallen wire cutters, turned them over once in her hand before tucking them into her coat pocket, like a woman collecting evidence for a ledger of an entirely different kind. Knives require a man to get close enough to use them properly. Guns don't. I'll take a knife over a gun most nights, Mr. Holloway, and I'd thank you to lower that rifle before you shoot one of your own cattle, by accident. Garrick lowered the rifle slowly. He was still staring at her. Not the way the platform had stared, not the shock of size and strangeness. Something else now, something that had started somewhere in his chest and hadn't finished traveling yet. You could have woken me, he said. Quieter now. I could have. Why didn't you? Augusta looked at him a long moment. The moon was behind her, throwing her face half into shadow, and when she finally answered, her voice had lost some of its earlier iron. Because in my whole life, she said, there have been exactly two kinds of people. The ones who look at what I am and decide I must need protecting, and the ones who look at what I am and understand I might be the one doing the protecting. A pause. I wanted to see tonight which kind of house I'd walked into. Seemed simpler to just go find out. Garrick didn't answer right away, because what was there to say to that? What was there to say to a woman who'd stepped off a train that morning, and already, in under 12 hours, upended everything he thought he knew about his own grass, his own books, and now his own fence line, all without so much as raising her voice? Which kind of house is it? He said finally. Now that you've found out. Something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. Gone as fast as it came. Ask me again in a week, she said, and walked back toward the house, leaving him standing alone in the moonlit pasture, with a rifle he no longer needed and a whole new set of questions. He wasn't sure how to hold. Cyrus Tate was waiting on the porch when they came back up from the pasture. Lamp in hand, face unreadable in the half-light, heard some commotion, he said. Everything all right out there? Fence cut, Garrick said. Rustler. Mrs. Vale ran him off. Something flickered across Cyrus's face. Fast. Gone before Garrick could name it, same as it had been that afternoon at the wagon. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to calculation. A man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the sum. That right, Cyrus said. Lucky then. Could have been worse, could have, Augusta agreed, watching him with those gray ledger-line eyes. Though I have to wonder, Mr. Tate, how a man cuts fence and moves a saddled horse into position without a soul on this ranch hearing him coming. Seems to me a good foreman keeps a tighter watch than that. Cyrus's jaw tightened, just slightly. Big spread. Ma'am. Man can't be everywhere. No, Augusta said. I suppose he can't. She held his gaze, a beat longer than was comfortable. I'll want those ledgers first thing tomorrow, Mr. Tate. All of them, including whatever's kept separate from the rest. The lamp in Cyrus's hand didn't shake, but something behind his pale eyes did. Whatever you need, ma'am, he said, and smiled that same smile from the wagon, the one that never once touched his eyes. He tipped his hat and walked off toward the bunkhouse, boots loud on the porch boards, and Garrick watched him go with a small furrow forming between his brows, the first thread, though he didn't know it yet, of a suspicion that would take root slow over the coming days and grow into something he couldn't ignore. Augusta watched him too. "You trust that man?" she asked, once Cyrus was well out of earshot. 6 years, Garrick said. Never had cause not to. Cause has a way of hiding, Augusta said, in men who are careful about where they keep it. She turned toward the door. Good night, Mr. Holloway. I believe we've both got an early morning coming. She left him, there on the porch, moonlight and lamp glow mixing strange across the yard, and Garrick stood a long while after she'd gone in, turning the last hour over and over in his mind like a stone he couldn't quite skip right. A woman who read grass better than he did. A woman who'd walked out, alone into the dark after an armed man, and come back not even breathing hard. A woman his brother had loved enough to write home about, over and over. In letters Garrick had only half read at the time because he'd been too busy running 4,000 acres the way his father always had. He thought about that phrase, running it. Like the land was a horse you broke once and never had to think about again. He looked out at the dark shape of the pasture, the cut fence somewhere out there, waiting to be mended come morning. And for the first time in longer than he could easily say, Garrick Holloway felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with rustlers or fence wire at all. He went inside. Didn't sleep much. Morning came up hard and gold over the caprock, the way it always did, indifferent to whatever had happened in the dark hours before it. Garrick was up before dawn out of habit, out on the porch with his coffee. Watching the light change on the grass, Augusta had called Thin 4 miles out from the house. She was already awake. He found that out when he came around the side of the barn and saw her standing at the fence line, where the rustler had cut the wire the night before. Not fixing it, just looking at it, running her gloved fingers along the severed strands like she was reading something written there, in a language only she understood. Couldn't sleep, he asked. Didn't try very hard to. She didn't turn around. I want to ride the property today. All of it, if we can manage it before dark. I have questions that don't have answers on paper. That's a full day's ride. Then we'd best start early, he almost argued. Almost told her a woman, fresh off a 2-day train trip, fresh off chasing down an armed rustler in the middle of the night. Ought to rest a spell before she went, charging out across 4,000 acres, asking hard questions of the land itself. He looked at her face instead, at the set of her jaw, the particular stillness in her that he was starting to recognize as the shape her grief took when it had nowhere else to go. I'll saddle the horses, he said. They rode out at first light, and it was nothing at all like the wagon ride from the day before. This time, Augusta asked questions the entire way, not cattle questions. Garrick had braced for cattle questions, had half a lifetime of answers ready about breeding stock and grazing rotation and the particular stubbornness of panhandle weather. These were different questions entirely. What does this section produce? In dollars. Over a season? What's it cost you to fence it, water it, and ride it over that same season? When did you last measure the grass yield against the number of head you're running on it? Garrick had answers for none of them. Not real answers. He had the answers his father had given him, 20 years back, and his father's answers had been the answers his father had given him, another 20 years before that. He knew this land the way you know an old friend's face. Every line of it familiar, every mood of the sky over it, something he could read without thinking. But the numbers? The actual numbers. He didn't have those. Had never needed them, or so he'd told himself for 20 years. By midday they'd covered the eastern range, the good land, the 1,000 acres that ran thick and green along the river bottom. Augusta had little to say about that stretch, beyond a few notes scratched into the small book she carried, everywhere now, tucked against her side like another limb. They stopped near noon at a stand of cottonwoods along the river, watered the horses, and ate cold biscuits and jerky in a silence that had by then started to feel less like distance and more like company. Then they turned west, and the land began to change, slow at first. Grass going sparser, the color shifting from deep green to a used-up yellow-brown. That Garrick had always told himself was just the season, just the drought, just the way West Texas land looked in a dry year. Augusta reined in, sat her horse a long moment, looking out over 3,000 acres of scrub and caliche and cattle standing thin-ribbed under a punishing sun. How long has it looked like this? She asked. Garrick followed her gaze. Really looked, for maybe the first time in years, instead of just seeing what he expected to see. 10 years, he heard himself say, and the number surprised him even as it left his mouth. Maybe more, and in 10 years, Augusta said, quiet. How many times have you considered that this land might not be worth running cattle on at all? The question landed like a slap, same as the ones from the wagon the first day, direct. Unkind only in the sense that truth is sometimes unkind. When a man's been avoiding it a long, long time, this is Holloway land, Garrick said, sharper than he meant to. My father bled for this land, fought for the water rights on it. Buried 2 good horses breaking it to graze in the first place. I don't doubt that. Then don't sit there and tell me it's not worth anything. Augusta turned in her saddle to look at him fully, and there was no cruelty in her face. None at all. Only that same terrible clarity she'd carried since the train platform. I'm not telling you it's not worth anything, Mr. Holloway. I'm telling you it's not worth what it's costing you. Those are different sentences. And I think you know that. Somewhere under all that pride, or you wouldn't be looking at this ground the way you're looking at it right now. Garrick didn't answer, because she was right. Because some part of him, some part he'd kept buried under 20 years of doing things his father's way, of running 4,000 acres, because 4,000 acres was what a Holloway ran, of never once stopping long enough to ask the land a hard question. Some part of him had known this for years, and simply refused to say the word out loud. Drowning Ellie's word, though Garrick didn't know it yet, didn't know his brother had written it in a letter that would surface soon enough and change everything again. He turned his horse away from her. Rode a little ways off, alone, out toward the fence line where the grass gave up entirely and the caleche showed through like bone under thinning skin. Augusta let him go. Didn't follow. Didn't call after him. Just sat her horse in the punishing sun and watched a proud man ride, a little distance away to be alone with a truth he wasn't ready to say out loud yet, and understood, because she'd buried a husband, because she knew exactly what it cost a person to hold on to something long, after it stopped making sense to hold on. That some truths needed room to breathe before a person could carry them home. They didn't speak again until they'd nearly finished the loop, cresting the last low rise before the ranch house came back into view. Sprawled low and golden in the late afternoon light, Garrick broke the silence first. My father used to say, a Holloway doesn't sell land. His voice was rough. Not angry anymore. Just tired, in the particular way a man gets tired when he's been carrying something heavy, so long he forgot it had weight. Said land was the only thing in this world that couldn't lie to you. Land doesn't lie, Augusta said. But it doesn't forgive neglect either. It just goes quiet, stops giving. Waits for someone to notice. She looked at him, steady. Your father wasn't wrong. That land tells the truth, Mr. Holloway. He just never taught you how to listen to it properly. That's not a failing in you. That's a thing I can teach if you'll let me. Garrick looked at her for a long moment. At the size of her, still strange to his eyes. Still something his mind kept trying and failing to fully take in. At the steadiness underneath it, the same steadiness that had walked out, alone into a moonlit pasture, after an armed stranger, without so much as a flicker of fear. Eli said you were the smartest person he ever knew. Garrick said again, quieter this time. I think I'm starting to understand why. Something moved across Augusta's face. Grief, maybe. Or something standing close enough beside grief that from a distance they looked the same. He said the same about you, she said. Said you were the strongest man he ever knew. Strong enough to carry the whole weight of this place on your back without ever once asking for help. A pause. Her eyes went out over the darkening land. The caprock catching the last gold light of the day. I used to think that was a compliment, the way he said it. I've come to understand these last 2 days that it might have been a worry instead. They rode the rest of the way to the house in silence, but it was again a different silence than before. Not strangers anymore, not exactly. Something in between. 2 people who had both loved the same man in different ways, and were only just beginning to understand what that shared loss might mean for the strange, uncertain ground opening up between them now. Supper that night was quieter still. Cyrus Tate joined them at Garrick's request, ledgers under his arm. Looking for all the world like a man walking toward a gallows he'd built with his own 2 hands, and was only now realizing the size of Augusta, laid the books open on the table between the plates. Went through them, page by page, in that same neat banker's voice, cataloging everything she'd found the night before. The feed costs from Coombs Supply, risen 4 times past reason. The payroll figures that didn't square with hours worked. The 3,000 acres bleeding, slow and steady, while the good thousand carried the weight of the whole operation, without anyone ever writing that truth down plain. Cyrus's face didn't change much through most of it, but his hands did. Garrick watched them. Watched the way Cyrus's fingers tightened around his coffee cup when Augusta got to the feed costs. Watched the way he shifted in his chair, just slightly, when she mentioned checking the COOMS, rates against county averages, small things, the kind of small things a man doesn't notice unless he's already half looking for them. And Garrick, without quite meaning to, without quite understanding why yet, found himself looking. These figures, tap into column with gloved finger, don't square with anything I can find in the county records for feed pricing. I'll want to see the original invoices from the Coombs house. All of them, going back 3 years. Those be filed separate, ma'am, Cyrus said. His voice was even. Too even, maybe. Take some digging to pull them all together. Then you'd best start digging, Mr. Tate. I've got nothing but time. Cyrus held her gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. Whatever you need, he said again, and smiled that same smile, the one that never touched his eyes. Garrick watched it happen. Watched the smile land and fade, and watched Cyrus Tate excuse himself from the table, a few minutes later with the ledgers tucked back under his arm, boots loud on the porch boards. As he crossed out toward the bunkhouse in the dark, "You noticed," Augusta said, once he was gone. Not a question. Noticed what? His hands. When I mentioned Coombs, Garrick looked at her. I noticed, he admitted. Good. She closed the ledger in front of her, slow, deliberate. Because I think, Mr. Holloway, that the fence wasn't the only thing on this ranch that got cut open last night. And I don't believe for one moment that the two things are unrelated. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters, the same restless wind that had followed Augusta Vale in off the train the day before and hadn't let up since. And Garrick sat at his own supper table, in his own house, built by his own father's hands, and understood, for the first time in 20 years, that everything he thought, he knew, about his life was about to come apart at the seams. He didn't know yet how far apart. He only knew that the woman across the table, built like she'd stepped whole out of a story too big for ordinary telling, wasn't finished looking. Not by a long way. The barn roof needed shingles, and shingles meant a trip into town. Garrick offered to go alone. Said it plain, the way a man offers a thing he half expects to be refused. No need for you to sit through that, he said. Amarillo's got a long memory for anything worth staring at. I've been stared at in finer towns than this one, Augusta said. I'll come. They took the wagon at first light. The road into town ran through country Augusta had already ridden twice now, and she watched it pass with the particular attention of a woman, cataloging a thing she meant to know completely. Which fence posts leaned? Which stretches of Kalish Road washed out first when it rained? Which neighbors' cattle had wandered onto Holloway grass and stayed there long enough that nobody had bothered running them back? Amarillo hadn't gotten any smaller since the day she'd stepped off the train, but it felt smaller, somehow, from the seat of a wagon she'd ridden in before, headed toward a house that had started, in just a handful of days, to feel less like a stranger's roof, and more like a thing she might one day call her own. The dry goods store sat at the corner of Polk Street, its windows crowded with tin pails and bolts of calico, and a hand-lettered sign advertising, "Seed corn at a price." Augusta's eye caught and filed away without meaning to. Fair, for the season, somebody in this town at least, hadn't decided to gouge a customer just because the customer had no easy way of checking. The bell over the door rang sharp when they walked in, and the store went quiet, the particular way rooms had been going quiet around Augusta for 29 years. A woman near the fabric bolts stopped mid-sentence. A boy sweeping the floor froze with the broom still in motion, then remembered himself, and kept sweeping, too fast, too hard, the way boys do when they've been caught staring and don't know what else to do with their hands. Augusta didn't flinch, she never did. She'd learned a long time ago that flinching only taught a room it had won something, Mr. Holloway. The proprietor came around the counter, a stout man with spectacles, pushed up on his forehead, and if he noticed anything unusual about the woman standing beside Garrick, he had the good sense not to show it past the first half-second. "Shingles, is it? Got a fresh order in from Fort Worth just Tuesday. That'll do," Garrick said. The proprietor's eyes flicked to Augusta anyway, the way eyes always did, quick and then quickly away. The way a man looks at weather he can't quite believe. "Ma'am," he said, recovering himself. "Don't believe we've met, Augusta Vale." She didn't offer further explanation, and after a beat, didn't need to. "Widow of the younger Holloway boy," the woman by the fabric bolts said, not quite under her breath. The way small towns say things not quite under their breath, because they want the words heard, without having to own them outright. Augusta turned toward her, unhurried. "That's right," she said. "And you'd be—" "Mrs. Prather," the woman lifted her chin, testing. The way people test a thing they're not sure will hold their weight. "My husband runs cattle out past the Simmons place. Then you'll know the grass has been thin. Out that way too, this year," Augusta said. "I'd be curious whether you've noticed the same pattern I have. Good ground doing double duty while the poor ground just sits there collecting dust and calling itself a ranch." Mrs. Prather blinked. It was not the conversation she'd braced for. Augusta had learned, over 29 years, that very little disarmed a room faster than simply refusing to be the spectacle it had prepared itself to gawk at, and offering instead something the room hadn't expected a woman her size to have, an opinion worth listening to. Well, Mrs. Prather set down the bolt of calico in her hands. "I hadn't put words to it quite that way, but yes. My husband said much the same some nights when he thinks I'm not listening. Husbands rarely credit us with listening," Augusta said. "It's one of their more forgivable failings." Something that might have been a laugh moved through the store, quiet, surprised at itself, and the particular tension that had walked in the door with Augusta, eased by half. Garrick, over by the counter, watched the whole exchange with an expression Augusta couldn't quite name. Not quite pride. Something a shade more complicated than that, and a shade warmer. They were loading the shingles into the wagon bed when a man came out of the feed store across the street. Narrow, through the shoulders, a ledger book under one arm. Moving with the particular brisk, unbothered walk of a man who'd never once in his life had to wonder whether a room noticed him. Ezra Coombs. Augusta knew him before Garrick said the name. She'd seen his name often enough in the ranch's own ledgers these past nights. Coombs' Supply House. The entries climbing higher every season, and something about the ease in his walk, the way he moved like a man who'd never once had to explain himself to anybody, told her she was looking at the other half of a problem she hadn't finished naming yet. Coombs's eyes passed over her once, assessing, and something in his face shifted. Not the shock of the platform, not quite. Something closer to recognition. The look of a man taking the measure of a problem he hadn't expected to arrive quite so soon, or quite so large. "Mr. Holloway." Coombs tipped his hat, easy, unbothered. "And this'll be the widow, I take it. Heard you'd got yourself some new eyes on the books." "You heard right," Augusta said. "I'll be sending a letter round to your office this week, Mr. Coombs. About your feed invoices." Something that flickered behind Coombs's eyes, there and gone, fast. The same particular arithmetic Cyrus's face had done at the wagon that first day. "Happy to clear anything up, ma'am," he said. "Books get muddled easy enough this far out from a proper county clerk, I imagine they do," Augusta said, "especially when somebody's counting on nobody looking closely enough to unbuttle them." Coombs's smile thinned, just slightly, the exact same way Cyrus's did. And for the first time Garrick saw it, plain. The shape of a partnership between two men who'd found each other's convenience useful for longer than either had bothered to admit. Coombs tipped his hat again and walked on. Unhurried, and Augusta watched him go with the particular stillness of a woman, adding one more name to a column she'd already half-written in her head. "You knew him," Garrick said, once they were back on the wagon bench. Shingles stacked behind them. "I knew his handwriting," Augusta said. Knowing the man himself was just a matter of time. They rode home in a silence that had by now stopped feeling like silence at all. and started feeling like something closer to company. 3 days, Cyrus Tate said. 3 days turned into 5. 5 turned into a week, and every time Augusta asked, there was a new reason, filed wrong, lost in the move from the old office. Coombs himself was slow to respond to a letter. Augusta stopped asking, started looking instead, because that was the difference between a banker's daughter and everybody else on this ranch. She didn't wait for a man to hand her the truth when he had every reason on earth not to. She found the receipt book in the tack room, not hidden, exactly. Just tucked, where nobody thought, to look because nobody thought a widow. Twice Cyrus Tate's size would go crawling through a tack room at 6 in the morning with a lamp in one hand, and her sleeves rolled up like a woman, half her age. Old ledger, water-stained, Coombs Supply House stamped across the cover in faded ink. She sat on an overturned feed bucket and opened it right there. And there it was, actual prices, county prices. Half, sometimes less than half, of what Cyrus had been logging in the ranch's own books for 3 straight years. Augusta went very still. Because still is what happens when the number in front of you is too big to react to properly. Still is what happens right before the anger arrives, not instead of it. She did the math anyway. Couldn't help herself. Numbers were the one language that never lied to her, not even when everything else in a room was lying its head off. 6 years, give or take. That's how long the gap had been growing. If the earliest pages in this book were any guide, thousands of dollars, not stolen in one clean sweep, the way a man robs a bank. Stolen slow. $1 here, $2 there. Bled out of a ranch that trusted its foreman the way you trust a man, who's ridden beside you for the better part of a decade. She closed the book, sat there a moment in the gray morning light, listening to horses shift in their stalls, and felt something harden in her chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with fury. She brought it to Garrick before breakfast. Laid the receipt book on the kitchen table next to his coffee, opened to the page that damned Cyrus Tate 6 ways from Sunday, and watched his face while he read it. Watched it change, slow at first, confusion. Then the numbers landed, really landed, and his jaw went tight enough that Augusta could see the muscle jump under his skin. This can't be right. It's right. Cyrus wouldn't. Cyrus did. Garrick shoved back from the table. Stood. Paced 2 steps toward the window and back, hands working like he needed something to do with them, or he was going to put a fist through the wall. 6 years, he said. Not a question. A number he was trying to make sense of, and couldn't. Give or take, he rode with my father. Broke horse with me when we were boys. He was at Eli's funeral, Augusta. He stood right there at the graveside. With the rest of us. I know. So how does a man do that? How does a man stand at a grave and rob the family the same week? Augusta didn't have an answer for that. Some things numbers couldn't explain. Numbers could only tell you what happened, not why a man's heart went crooked enough to let it. They confronted him that afternoon, not gently. Garrick called him up to the house instead of riding out to find him, which Augusta understood without being told was itself a message. A man got called to the house when something was about to end. Cyrus came in with his hat in his hand and something already wrong in his face. He'd read the room before he'd even crossed the threshold. Men who'd spent years lying got good at reading rooms. Sit down, Garrick said. I'll stand. Sit down, Cyrus, he sat. Augusta set the receipt book on the table between them. Didn't say anything. Let the silence do the work while Cyrus looked at it and didn't reach for it. 6 years, Garrick said. That's what she found so far. 6 years of you skimming off feed costs while I trusted you with the books, because my father trusted you with the books. Garrick, don't. The word came out like a door slamming. Cyrus's jaw worked. For a moment, just a moment. Something like shame crossed his face. And then it was gone, replaced by something harder. Something cornered. You want to know why, Cyrus said. Quiet. Bitter. 12 years I've worked this land. 12 years, and you never once offered me a share of it. Not a foot of ground, not a dollar past wages. I watched you inherit 4,000 acres you didn't earn, and I decided I'd earn my own piece the only way anybody was going to let me. That's not earning, Augusta said. Her voice was low, even, and underneath it, iron. That's theft with a sad story attached. I've heard better excuses from men half your age. Cyrus's eyes cut to her. Nobody asked you. Nobody had to. She didn't blink. You've been robbing this family since before I ever set foot off that train, Mr. Tate. My arriving just meant somebody finally opened the books properly. That's not my crime to apologize for. That's yours to answer. Something ugly moved behind Cyrus's eyes. You think you know this land, he said. You think you know these people. You've been here a week. I've read the numbers for a week, Augusta said. The numbers have been talking for 6 years. I just happened to be the first one willing to listen. Cyrus stood so fast. His chair scraped hard against the floor. You'll regret this, he said. Low, not quite a threat. Not quite. Not one either. Both of you. He was gone before either of them could answer. Boots hard on the porch. A horse's hooves a moment later. Fast. Heading north. Away from the ranch. Away from 12 years of a life he'd apparently decided wasn't worth explaining any further. Garrick sat down heavy in the chair Cyrus had left empty. That went about as bad as it could have gone, he said. No, Augusta said. Quiet. Watching the window, the dust still hanging, where Cyrus's horse had torn out of the yard. It could go a great deal worse than that. And I have a feeling, Mr. Holloway, that it's about to. She was right. It took 4 days to find out how right. A letter arrived for Augusta that same week, delivered by a rider, none of the hands recognized, a boy no older than 16 who wouldn't meet anybody's eyes and rode off again before anyone could ask him a proper question. She tucked it unopened into her saddlebag. There wasn't time to read it. The herd was moving in the morning and 600 head of cattle didn't wait on anybody's correspondence. What was coming arrived 2 days later. In the worst possible way, the herd was due to move 600 head. Driven north to the rail depot at Dalhart for the spring sale. Money the ranch needed badly now. More badly than ever, with a debt hanging over it that Garrick had only just learned was real. Every hand was riding. Old Absalom on point, young Ray and the others flanking. The whole slow column of cattle and dust winding up through the narrow pass at Comanche Draw, the one stretch of the drive that always made Garrick's stomach tight, because the walls rose steep on either side, and there was nowhere for 600 head to go but forward. Augusta rode with them. Garrick had argued against it, lost the argument in under a minute, same as he'd lost every argument with this woman since she stepped off that train. I'll ride the flank, she'd said. I've done harder things than sit a horse for a day, Mr. Holloway. He hadn't doubted that. He'd stopped, doubting most things about her sometime around the night. She walked out alone into the dark after an armed rustler, and came back without so much as raising her pulse. The trouble started at the mouth of the draw. A shot. Then 2 more, fast echoing off the canyon walls until it was impossible to tell how many guns were actually firing. The herd bolted, 600 head of cattle, panicked, turning as one animal instead of 600 separate ones. A wall of muscle and horn crashing sideways into the narrowest part of the pass, and riders coming down off the ridge on both sides, masked fast, driving the herd deliberately, cutting for the stragglers at the rear, rustlers. A dozen at least, working the draw like men who'd planned it a long time. Garrick's horse reared under him. He fought it down, drew his rifle, shouted something Augusta couldn't make out over the thunder of hooves and the crack of gunfire echoing wall to wall. She saw Ray go down, not shot, thrown, his horse stumbling in the chaos, pitching him hard into the dirt, directly in the path of the stampeding herd, and there was no time. There was no time at all. The wall of cattle already closing the gap between Ray's fallen body and certain death under 600 sets of hooves. Augusta didn't think. She kicked her horse forward, hard, cutting across the front edge of the stampede at an angle no sane rider would attempt. And when her horse balked at the last second, refusing to close the final distance, she did the only thing left to do. She threw herself down out of the saddle, hit the ground running, reached Ray a half second before the herd did, hauled him up off the ground with one arm like he weighed nothing at all, and turned to face 600 head of panicked cattle, bearing down on both of them with nowhere left to run. There was a wagon, abandoned at the mouth of the draw hours before, one wheel broken, left for repair before the drive. Heavy, timber-framed, exactly the kind of obstacle that might turn a stampede's momentum if something strong enough put it in the right place at the right moment. Augusta set Ray down behind it, turned, put both hands against the wagon's side, and pushed. It should not have moved. Not that fast, not that far, not with the ground rutted and uneven beneath it, but it moved, screeching, groaning timber and iron shrieking in protest, swinging broadside just as the front of the herd reached it, breaking their line, splitting the stampede around the obstacle in two ragged halves, instead of one unstoppable wall. Cattle streamed past on either side. Close enough that Augusta felt the heat off their bodies, the wind of their passing whipping her coat against her legs, and then it was over. The herd, thinning, scattered, riders regrouping, to bring them back under control further down the draw. And Augusta stood there, chest heaving, hands raw and bleeding from the wagon's rough timber. Ray sitting stunned and whole in the dirt behind her. Garrick reached them at a dead run, threw himself off his horse before it had even fully stopped, and for one long moment he simply stood there, staring at her. At the wagon shoved a full 10 feet sideways, into a rutted furrow, at the boy sitting dazed, but breathing at her feet. "You could have died," he said, voice cracked clean in half. "Augusta, you could have. I didn't. That's not the point. It is in fact entirely the point." She was breathing hard, but her voice when it came was steady as the ground under a fence post. "Ray's alive. That was the point. Everything else is just arithmetic I'll do later." Garrick looked at her, really looked, the way he'd been looking at her for a week now and still hadn't fully caught up to. The size of her. Yes. The strength of her, undeniable now in a way no one on this ranch would ever again mistake for spectacle. But under it, something else. Something that had nothing to do with height or breadth of shoulder. Courage that didn't wait to be asked. "Who fired those shots?" he said, turning toward the ridge, toward the retreating dust of riders already melting back into the broken country, north of the draw. "I don't know." But she thought she did. And from the look on Garrick's face, so did he. They found Cyrus's hat 3 days later, snagged on brush a half-mile from the draw, where a man might drop it scrambling off a ridge in a hurry, not realizing until too late what he'd left behind. Garrick held it a long moment, turned it over in his hands the way he'd turned his own hat over that first day at the Amarillo platform, a lifetime ago. Though it had only been a week and a half, "He's not just a thief anymore," Garrick said quietly. "He tried to kill people today." "My people, he tried to kill your herd," Augusta said. "I don't think Cyrus wanted anyone dead. I think Cyrus wanted a disaster big enough that when the bank came calling on that note, you wouldn't have the money or the cattle left to fight it. That's not better." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked north, toward the broken country where the riders had disappeared, toward wherever Cyrus Tate had run to lick his wounds and plan whatever came next. "There's something else," she said. Quiet, careful, in the way she'd learned to be careful with things that might break a man clean in half if handed to him wrong. "A letter came for me the morning we rode out with the herd. I didn't have time to open it until last night, going through my saddlebag by lamplight. From my father." She made herself say the rest, all of it, though every word cost her something. "He knows Cyrus. Has known him, I don't know how long. Long enough to be counting on the state of your books being bad enough to force a sale of this ranch when the old debt comes due." A breath. "I think my father sent me here believing I'd be useful to him. I think he was right. For a while, without my knowing it." Garrick was quiet. A long moment. The wind moved through the draw behind them, stirring the dust where 600 head of cattle had nearly trampled a boy to death an hour before, and somewhere far off a hawk called once and went silent. "Do you still think that?" Garrick said finally. "That you're useful to him?" Augusta looked at him, at the hat still turning slow in his hands, at the raw place in his face that hadn't closed since the moment he'd watched her throw a wagon 10 feet to sideways for a boy who wasn't even her own kin. "No," she said. "I think I stopped being useful to my father the moment I decided I'd rather be useful to you." The words hung there in the dust and the wind, bigger than either of them had meant them to be, and neither one moved to take them back. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that had, for the first time since the platform, nothing uncertain in it at all. The silence of two people who had just told each other the truth and found the ground still held. The bank's letter arrived on a Tuesday, formal, cold, every word of it dressed up in language meant to sound reasonable, meant to sound like nothing personal at all, except every line of it was personal. Every line of it had her father's fingerprints pressed so deep into the phrasing that Augusta could practically hear his voice reading it aloud. Note called due. 30 days. Full amount. Or the bank takes possession of the note's collateral. 4,000 acres. Garrick read it standing in the kitchen doorway, morning light behind him, and Augusta watched something in his shoulders go rigid the way a man's shoulders go rigid right before they break. 30 days, he said. 30 days. That's not a demand. That's an execution, with a delay on it. Yes, Augusta said. Quiet. Because there wasn't a gentler way to say it, and she'd never once in her life insulted a person by pretending a hard truth was softer than it was. That's exactly what it is. She wrote to her father that same afternoon, not a plea. She'd never once, in 29 years, pleaded with Nathaniel Vale for anything, and she wasn't about to start now. Not when pleading was precisely the kind of a weakness he'd trained her to recognize and exploit in other people. She wrote him numbers instead. Wrote him the true feed costs, cross-checked against county rates. Wrote him the exact dollar figure Cyrus Tate had skimmed over 6 years, and the exact dollar figure the ranch had lost, running 3,000 unprofitable acres it should have sold a decade ago. Wrote him, in her own small, precise hand, the hand he'd taught her himself, a complete and devastating account of every way his hired man had bled this family. Dry while her father sat in St. Louis waiting to collect the wreckage. And then she wrote one more line. You taught me never to sign my name to a thing I hadn't examined myself. I have examined this, every page of it, and I find that the man behind this scheme is not the rancher you're trying to ruin. It's the banker who raised me. She sealed it, sent it. Didn't sleep that night, not from doubt, but from the particular exhaustion of finally saying a true thing to a man who'd spent her whole life teaching her to say only useful ones. The answer came back 6 days later, not from her father, from a lawyer. Cold, formal. Confirming that the note stood as written, that Mr. Vale saw no cause to reconsider terms, that the bank would proceed as planned should payment not be received in full by the specified date. Augusta read it twice. Set it down slow. He didn't even answer himself, she said. Garrick, across the table, said nothing for a long moment. Would it have mattered, he said finally, if he had? Augusta looked at the letter. At her own careful numbers, sent and apparently unread, or read, and simply not enough to move a man who had built his whole life on the belief that mercy was a poor investment. No, she admitted. I don't think it would have. They had 18 days left when the railroad man came calling. His name was Everett Sloan, and he arrived in a good coat and a better hat, driving a hired buggy up the long road to the house, like a man who already knew he'd be welcome, because men like Everett Sloan were always welcome somewhere. That was the whole trick of them. The Panhandle and Northerns, looking to run a spur line through this country, he said, laying a map across the porch table like he owned the porch too. Straightest route runs clean through your western range, Mr. Holloway. The part that isn't much good for grazing anyhow, from what I hear. Garrick's jaw tightened. Where'd you hear that? Sloan smiled. Didn't answer directly, which was answer enough. We're prepared to pay handsomely, he said instead, for the right-of-way. More than fair market on grazing land, given what it'd be worth to us for track. And if I say no, then we survey around you, and you keep 3,000 acres of land that isn't earning you a dime, and the railroad goes elsewhere. And somehow, Mr. Holloway, Sloan's smile widened, thin and knowing. I suspect a note comes due before that land ever finds another buyer half as generous as us. Augusta, standing silent in the doorway through most of this, finally stepped forward. Who told you about the note, she said. Sloan's eyes cut to her, recalculated, the way every stranger's eyes did. The same slow arithmetic she'd watched 100 times now and stopped waiting to be comfortable with. Word travels, ma'am. Word travels fast. Augusta said, for a debt that was called due less than a week ago. I'd be curious who's doing the traveling for it. Sloan didn't answer that either. He didn't have to. Augusta already knew. That night, she laid it all out on the kitchen table. Same as she'd laid out the ledgers that first evening a lifetime ago, when all of this had still just looked like a widow settling a small estate. Your father, Garrick said slowly, working it through out loud, calls the note due, forces a sale, buys the land cheap through the bank, then sells the exact same land to the railroad for 4 times what he paid. That would be my guess. And Sloan already knows the number my father's expecting to sell it for. That would also be my guess. Augusta's jaw was tight. Her gray eyes gone hard as the ledger lines she'd spent a week reading by lamplight. Which means my father isn't just calling in an old debt, Garrick. He's already sold this land in his head. He's just waiting for the paperwork to catch up to the plan. Garrick sat back, ran a hand down his face, the way a man does when he's out of easy answers and hasn't yet found his way to the hard ones. 18 days, he said. I don't have the cash to clear that note in 18 days. Not honest cash. Not without selling the herd at half its worth to some buyer who knows exactly how desperate I am. Augusta was quiet a long moment. Then she stood, walked to the window, looked out at the dark shape of the land beyond it, 3,000 acres of thin grass and hard ground. The same ground she'd ridden across on her second morning in Texas and called, without softening a word of it, land holding on by memory. What if you didn't sell the land to clear the debt? She said slowly. What if you sold the debt itself? Somewhere else. Somewhere my father can't touch. Garrick looked up. What are you talking about? Augusta turned from the window, and there was something in her face now that hadn't been there a moment before. Not grief, not fury, but the particular light of a woman who'd just found the one column in the ledger nobody else had thought to check. I'm talking about my own money, she said. Not my father's, mine. What Eli left me. What I've earned managing my father's smaller accounts these past 4 years, quietly, in my own name, because I learned a long time ago never to keep all my worth in accounts a man again could reach into. A pause. It isn't enough to clear the note outright, but it's enough to buy it, from a different bank. One that owes my father nothing and would be glad of the interest on a note this size. Garrick stared at her. You'd do that? I already wrote the letter, Augusta said. 2 days ago. I was waiting to see if there was any other way first. Her voice softened, just slightly, just enough. There isn't. So I'm done waiting. The Amarillo Trust Bank agreed to the purchase in 9 days. Augusta rode in herself to sign the papers. 4,000 acres of debt changing hands, quiet and clean. Moving out from under Nathaniel Vale's reach forever, with nothing but a widow's signature and a lifetime of careful, separate saving that her own father had never once thought to ask about. She was riding back to the ranch, papers secured in her saddlebag, when she saw the smoke, black, thick, rising fast from the direction of the west pasture. Not grass fire, not lightning. This was too sudden, too contained, too much like a fire someone had set on purpose in exactly the place most likely to hurt. The hay barn. She kicked her horse into a dead run. By the time she reached the yard, half the ranch was already fighting it. Buckets. Wet blankets. Men shouting over the roar of flame, eating through a winter's worth of stored hay. The heat of it pushing back against every hand that got close enough to try. Garrick was at the center of it, soot black, shirt torn, directing a bucket line, with a voice gone raw from shouting. Augusta didn't stop to think. She never did, not when it mattered. She threw herself into the line. Passed buckets 2 at a time where other men passed one. Hauled a fallen support beam off a trapped stretch of fence line before it could catch, and spread the fire toward the main barn, lifting timber that should have taken 4 men and needed, in the end, only her. It took an hour to bring it under control. The hay barn was gone, a total loss. But the main barn stood, the horses stood, and when the last of the flame finally guttered down to smoke and ash, Garrick found Augusta, sitting on an overturned trough, hands blistered, face streaked black, breathing hard. He sat down beside her without a word. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, just breathed. Just watched the ruins smolder in the dark. "Cyrus," Garrick said finally. Cyrus, Augusta agreed. "He's not stopping. No." She looked at her own raw hands, turned them over slow. "I don't think men like Cyrus know how to stop. Once they've decided, the only way forward is to burn down everything behind them." Garrick was quiet. "Another moment. I bought the note," he said. Not quite a question, testing the shape of the words out loud, like a man who still couldn't quite believe the ground under him had held after all. "You bought it. This ranch isn't my father's plan anymore. It's not your father's either." "No," Augusta said. "It's just ours to save now, or lose. But at least it's honest, whichever way it goes." Something in Garrick's face cracked open then. The way it had been slowly cracking open for weeks, ever since a woman built like a doorway for someone else had stepped down off a train and upended everything he thought he understood about strength, about land, about what a person owed the dead and what they owed the living. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, "for any of it." "Don't thank me," Augusta said. "Help me find the man who did this instead." They found Cyrus 2 nights later, in a line shack 12 miles north, holed up with 2 of the riders who'd hit the herd at Comanche Draw. It wasn't Garrick who cornered him. It was old Absalom. Of all people, 60 years old, Wages Augusta herself had questioned that first night in the ledgers, riding out at first light with 3 other hands because, he said simply, Holloway land was Holloway land, and he'd buried the elder Holloway with his own 2 hands and wasn't about to let a thief burn down what was left of the man's legacy. Cyrus didn't run. There wasn't anywhere left to run to. He came in on a lead rope, quiet, hollowed out, the particular quiet of a man who'd spent his rage on a wagon in Comanche Draw, and a hay barn set alight in the dark, and had nothing left now but the wreckage of what all that rage had cost him. Garrick looked at him a long time before he said anything. 12 years, Garrick said finally. "I'd have given you land, Cyrus, if you'd asked. If you'd just once in 12 years asked, instead of taking." Cyrus didn't answer. Didn't have an answer, maybe. Some men don't, in the end. Some men spend so long convincing themselves the world owes them something that by the time the reckoning comes, there's no explanation left worth giving. The county sheriff came for him 2 days after that. Augusta didn't watch him go. There was nothing left in her that needed to see it. The note was clear. The threat was gone. But the west pasture still sat there, 3,000 acres of thin grass and hard ground, and Everett Sloane's railroad still wanted its right-of-way. He came back a week later, same good coat, same thin smile, though it faltered some when he found the deed no longer belonged to a desperate man with a bank breathing down his neck. "Circumstances have changed, I hear," Sloane said carefully. "They have," Augusta said. She'd taken to standing at Garrick's side for these conversations now, not behind him, and Sloane's eyes had stopped doing quite so much recalculating every time he looked at her. "Which means our price has changed too." Sloane's smile thinned further. "Ma'am, the original offer was more than fair. The original offer," Augusta said, "was priced for a man you believed had 30 days, and no choice. That man doesn't exist anymore, Mr. Sloane. You're negotiating with a woman who owns this note free and clear, has no debt hanging over her, and has exactly as much time as she cares to take." She named a figure, 4 times Sloane's original number. He argued for the better part of an hour. Argued the way men like Sloane always argued, circling and softening and trying every angle available to a man used to getting his way by, simply outlasting whoever sat across from him. Augusta outlasted him instead. She always had. It was, in the end, the one thing about her that had never changed from the moment she stepped off that train. Not the size of her, not the strength of her, but the patience underneath both, the particular stillness of a woman who had learned as a girl that numbers never got tired of being right, and neither did she. Sloane signed before sundown. The money came in slow but steady over the following months, enough to rebuild the hay barn twice over, enough to fence the good 1,000 acres properly, enough to buy better stock and pay honest wages to men who'd earned every dollar of them. The ranch that emerged, come autumn, was smaller than the one Garrick's father had built. It was also, for the first time in a decade, whole. Augusta found him out by the corral one evening, the sky gone that particular gold-orange. It only turned in the last hour before dark, and Garrick was standing at the fence with Eli's old horse, brushing it slow, the way he'd taken to doing most evenings now, though he'd never once spoken of why. She came and stood beside him. Didn't say anything for a while. Just watched the brush move slow over the horse's flank. Watched the last light catch gold in the dust rising off its coat. "He used to write to me about this," Garrick said finally. "About coming home someday. About the horse he'd left behind. Said he missed it more than he ever expected to." A pause. "I used to think that was strange. A man missing a horse more than he missed his own brother." "I don't think he missed the horse more," Augusta said. "I think the horse was easier to say out loud." Garrick looked at her. Something had settled in his face over these past weeks, something that hadn't been there that first day on the platform, when all he'd seen was the shock of her size and none of what stood underneath it. "I used to think I knew everything worth knowing about this land," he said. 20 years running it my father's way, never once asking whether the land agreed. Then you stepped off that train, and inside of 2 months you'd shown me exactly how much I didn't know. About the grass. About the books," he set the brush down slow. "About myself. Mostly." Augusta didn't answer right away. "I came here to settle an estate," she said finally. "I thought that meant signing a paper and going home. I didn't know it would mean finding out what my own father was capable of. Didn't know it would mean nearly losing everything, to save something that wasn't even mine to save." Her voice caught, just slightly, just once. "I didn't know it would mean this." "This," Garrick repeated. "Quiet, this," Augusta said, and reached for his hand, his ordinary-sized, calloused from 20 years of honest work, swallowed easily in her own, but held there gentle as anything he'd ever felt in his life. "Whatever this is. I'd like to find out. If you're willing." Garrick's hand tightened around hers. "I've been willing," he said, "since about the second night. When you walked out into the dark after an armed man, and came back like it was nothing at all. I just didn't have the sense to say so. Something that might have been a laugh, might have been closer to tears, moved through Augusta then, and she let it. Let herself, for the first time since a train had pulled into Amarillo 11 minutes late and changed the whole shape of her life, simply stand still and be exactly the size she was, in exactly the place she'd found herself, beside a man who stopped somewhere along the way, seeing her as anything other than the truest thing this ranch had ever been given. They married in the spring, in front of the rebuilt barn, with old Absalom standing witness. And half the county come to see the woman who'd saved the Holloway Ranch stand up in a plain gray dress and become, officially, exactly what she'd already been for months. Mrs. O'Dom had sewn the dress herself over 3 weeks of evenings, letting the seams out twice and taking in her pride each time a little further until she'd finally admitted, gruffly over a mouthful of pins, that she'd never in 40 years of sewing built a garment that fit a body so well suited to carrying weight, cloth or grief, or a whole ranch on its own 2 shoulders. It hardly mattered which. The county came in wagons, and on horseback, more of them than Garrick had expected. More than he'd have guessed cared one way or the other about a rancher's private business. But word had traveled the way word does in country, that wide and that empty, about the fire, and the note bought out from under a crooked banker's nose, and a woman who'd thrown a wagon 10 feet sideways to save a boy who wasn't even her own blood. People came to see the shape of a story they'd only heard second-hand, and stayed, most of them, because the shape of it turned out to be better than the telling. Mrs. Prather came, from the dry goods store visit weeks before, and brought a jar of preserves and an opinion about the spring planting that Augusta was glad enough to hear. Everett Sloan sent a telegram instead of a gift, which struck Garrick as exactly the kind of thing a railroad man would do, and which Augusta read aloud at supper the night before with more amusement than the message probably deserved. "Congratulations on the transaction," it said. No hard feelings on this end. Sloan had signed it with his full title, as though a man's business card could stand in for a wedding gift. And Augusta had laughed. For the first time in longer than Garrick could remember, a real laugh, unguarded, that made half the kitchen turn to look, and made Garrick's chest go tight and warm at the sound of it. Old Absalom stood at the front with them. Weathered hands folded, the same hands that had ridden out at first light to bring Cyrus Tate in on a lead rope. And when the preacher asked who gave this woman to be married, Absalom said, in a voice that carried clean across the whole gathered county, nobody gives Augusta Vale anywhere she hasn't already decided to go herself. But I'll stand up for her all the same, if that's what's wanted. It was, as far as anybody could tell, exactly the right thing to say, and half the crowd was still smiling about it when the preacher got around to the vows. Garrick's voice caught once, saying his, not from doubt, but from the particular ache of standing in front of the whole county and finally, publicly, admitting a thing he'd been circling for months without the nerve to name it outright. Augusta's voice didn't catch at all. She'd never once in her life said an important thing halfway, and she wasn't about to start, on the one day that mattered most. When it came time to kiss the bride, Garrick had to reach up some, which drew a low ripple of laughter through the crowd, warm and unmalicious. The kind of laughter a town gives when it's decided, finally and for good, that the thing in front of it isn't a spectacle anymore. It's just a wedding. Just two people who'd found each other the hard way, the way most worthwhile things get found. Ellie's horse stood saddled and groomed nearby, brushed that morning by both their hands together, the way it would be brushed most mornings for years to come. Not a monument to grief anymore, but something gentler, a promise kept. A brother remembered, not by the silence around his name, but by the two people he'd loved enough, in his own quiet way, to bring together long after he was gone. Later, after the county had eaten its fill, and drunk its toasts, and ridden home, under a sky gone violet at the edges. Augusta stood alone a moment by the corral fence, still in her wedding dress, watching the last of the light drain gold off the caprock. Garrick found her there, regretting it already, he asked, though there wasn't much worry in the asking. I was thinking about the first night, Augusta said. Sitting up with the ledgers, finding the first hole in the books, and thinking I'd come 400 miles to sign a paper and go home inside a week. She looked at him, and there was something in her face that had softened over the months into something Garrick had come to understand was simply happiness, the kind that didn't need to announce itself loudly to be entirely real. I don't think I've ever been so glad to be so wrong about anything. Wrong about the size of the disappointment, Garrick said. And something almost like his old teasing crept back into his voice. The first real lightness Augusta had heard from him since the platform. Considerably smaller disappointment than advertised, Augusta agreed. I've had 6 months to reconsider the figure. The land stretched gold and endless behind them, smaller now than it had once been, and worth, for the first time in a decade, exactly what it claimed to be, no more, no less. Just honest ground, under an honest sky, finally being looked at right, and two pieces standing on it together at last. Exactly where they'd both, in their own separate and stubborn ways, been trying to get to all along.